belong in this neighborhood. This is a safe area, and people like you are why crime is going up.
You need to leave. Now.
I'm just trying to get into my car. Can you please move so I can leave?
Are you threatening us? You're threatening
recording.
us.
Stop recording right now.
You don't belong in this neighborhood. This is a safe area. The woman's shrill voice cut through the parking lot air as she approached aggressively with her finger pointed, her eyes full of contempt she didn't try to hide. The black man standing beside his car simply froze for a moment, his shopping bag still in his hands, trying to process why he was being confronted when all he had done was park legally and shop like any other customer. Before he could respond, the woman continued her verbal attack, her voice becoming even louder and more hysterical as she declared that people like him were why crime was going up, throwing accusations based on absolutely nothing but the color of his skin. Her husband quickly joined the attack, taking a threatening step toward the man and demanding he leave immediately, physically blocking his path to the car as if he had some authority to control who could or couldn't be in that public parking lot. What this racist and arrogant couple didn't know was that they were about to commit the most expensive mistake of their lives, a mistake that would be captured on crystal-clear video and result in legal fines so devastating they would regret every second of that confrontation for the rest of their existence. Before we continue with this shocking story, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below, because stories like this need to be shared worldwide so people can see that racism has real and serious consequences. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens to this couple in the next few minutes will leave you absolutely stunned, and you won't want to miss a single detail of how their arrogance transformed into a legal nightmare. This is a true story of justice served, where every toxic word and every intimidating action was documented and used in court to deliver exactly the kind of consequences this type of behavior deserves. The victim of this racial aggression was DeAndre Patterson, a 34-year-old man who worked as a software engineer for one of the country's largest technology companies, earning a six-figure salary that allowed him to live comfortably in any neighborhood he chose. He had moved to that upper-middle-class suburb just 3 weeks earlier, attracted by the excellent schools for his 6-year-old daughter, the quiet tree-lined streets, and the proximity to his office, which was only 15 minutes away. DeAndre had been a single father since his wife had died in a car accident 2 years ago, and he dedicated every ounce of his energy to giving his daughter the best life possible while navigating the grief of raising a child alone. He never looked for trouble, was always polite to neighbors, always followed the rules, always paid his bills on time, and all he wanted was to live in peace and focus on being a good father and a competent professional. That Saturday afternoon, DeAndre had gone out to do weekly shopping at the local supermarket, leaving his daughter with his sister for a few hours so he could get household tasks done without distractions. He parked his blue Honda Accord in a perfectly legal spot in the shopping center parking lot where the supermarket was located, entered the store, bought everything he needed, and returned to his car about 40 minutes later, carrying 4 bags of groceries. The parking lot was moderately full since it was Saturday afternoon, with families coming and going, people loading purchases, the kind of normal weekend activity you'd expect in any suburban area. DeAndre was thinking about the dinner he would prepare for his daughter later, planning to make her favorite mac and cheese, followed by a Disney movie night, completely unaware that he was being watched with growing hostility by a couple who had parked 2 spaces ahead. The couple consisted of Margaret and Robert Henderson, both in their late 50s, comfortably retired after careers in corporate sales and business management. They had lived in that neighborhood for 23 years, time during which they had seen the area become progressively more diverse, a change they clearly didn't appreciate based on their private comments and public attitudes. Margaret was known in the neighborhood as someone who called the homeowners association about the most trivial infractions, measuring neighbors' grass height with a ruler and taking photos of trash cans left out for more than a few hours. Robert had a reputation for confronting anyone he thought didn't belong there, had made scenes on several occasions questioning delivery workers, landscapers, and even visitors to their own neighbors. When they saw DeAndre parking his car and getting out of it weeks ago, they immediately assumed he was there to commit some crime, an assumption based purely on racial prejudice that had absolutely no basis in the reality of the situation. DeAndre was placing the last bag in the back seat when he heard quick footsteps approaching from behind, and before he could fully turn around, Margaret's voice hit him like a verbal slap, declaring he didn't belong in that neighborhood. He turned slowly, his hands still visible holding the shopping bag, and saw the couple approaching him with expressions mixing anger and something that seemed like a distorted sense of moral authority. Margaret continued her attack without giving DeAndre a chance to respond, her voice rising in volume as she accused people like him of being responsible for rising crime rates, throwing imaginary statistics and manufactured fears as if they were unquestionable facts. Robert positioned himself beside his wife, his arms crossed over his chest in a clearly intimidating pose, partially blocking DeAndre's path around the car and creating a physical barrier that made it impossible to ignore them and simply leave. DeAndre felt his heart race not from fear of the couple itself, but from the painful recognition that he was experiencing exactly the type of casual racism he had hoped to leave behind by moving to a more affluent neighborhood. DeAndre took a deep breath and tried to keep his voice calm and balanced, responding that he was just trying to get into his car and asking politely if they could move so he could leave. Margaret's response was instant and bizarre, her eyes widening dramatically as she turned to her husband and asked loudly if DeAndre was threatening them, transforming a polite request into something sinister through pure, malicious interpretation. Robert immediately assumed an even more aggressive posture, taking a step toward DeAndre and declaring they wouldn't be intimidated, that they knew their rights and would call the police if he didn't cooperate. DeAndre looked around the parking lot searching for witnesses, seeing several people observing the scene from a distance, but no one approaching to help or intervene, everyone probably uncomfortable but unwilling to get involved. It was at this moment that DeAndre made a decision that would completely change the course of following events. He slowly reached into his pocket and took out his cell phone, calmly announcing he would record the interaction for his own protection. The couple's reaction to the camera was immediate and revealing. Robert practically exploded in fury, demanding DeAndre stop recording immediately, saying it was illegal to film people without permission and threatening to call the police for invasion of privacy. Margaret literally tried to cover the camera lens with her hand, stretching her arm toward DeAndre's phone in an attempt to prevent him from documenting what was happening. DeAndre stepped back, keeping the phone out of her reach while calmly explaining he was on public property and had every legal right to record the interaction, especially when being confronted and prevented from accessing his own vehicle. The couple's insistence on stopping the recording only confirmed what DeAndre already knew. They were perfectly aware their behavior was wrong and didn't want documented evidence of their actions. Margaret began screaming even louder, apparently trying to create a scene that would attract attention and possibly make DeAndre look like the aggressor, saying repeatedly she felt threatened and needed help. Other shoppers were approaching now, attracted by Margaret's increasing volume and the clear tension of the situation. A younger woman with 2 small children stopped at a safe distance and also began recording with her phone, apparently recognizing something deeply wrong was happening and wanting her own documentation of the incident. An older man with gray hair approached and asked if everything was okay, and DeAndre quickly explained he was simply trying to leave but was being blocked and harassed by this couple. Margaret immediately tried to control the narrative, turning to the older man and saying DeAndre was acting suspiciously and aggressively, that she and Robert were just concerned about neighborhood safety. The older man looked from Margaret to DeAndre, then to the shopping bags visible in the Honda's back seat, and his expression made it clear he wasn't buying Margaret's story for even a second. Robert realized the situation was spinning out of his control with witnesses now present and multiple cameras recording, so he changed tactics and declared he would call the police to resolve the situation. DeAndre responded calmly that was an excellent idea, that he also wanted police to come document officially that he was being harassed and prevented from leaving the parking lot. Margaret seemed momentarily confused by this response, clearly expecting the threat of involving police would make DeAndre back down or flee, but instead, he was actively inviting police intervention. The older man who had approached spoke again, telling the couple they seemed to be making a scene about nothing and that the young man was clearly just trying to leave with his groceries. Margaret turned her fury on the man, accusing him of not understanding the dangers of the neighborhood and being naive about how people with bad intentions operated, leaving her racist implications hanging in the air like a toxic cloud no one present could ignore or pretend didn't exist. Robert finally took out his own phone and dialed 911, his voice taking on a dramatic and urgent tone as he reported to the dispatcher that there was a suspicious man in the parking lot acting aggressively and threateningly. DeAndre heard every word of the distorted description and kept his camera pointed directly at Robert, capturing the blatant lie being told in real time while he himself remained completely still and calm several meters away. The dispatcher apparently asked questions because Robert began describing DeAndre in detail, mentioning his race as the first identifying characteristic, then his clothing, then claiming he had refused to leave the parking lot when asked, a complete inversion of reality where Robert and Margaret were the ones preventing DeAndre from leaving. Margaret added her own comments in the background of the call, saying loudly enough for the dispatcher to hear that she felt threatened and they needed officers immediately because the situation was escalating dangerously. DeAndre simply continued recording, his camera capturing not just the couple but also the surrounding witnesses who were watching with a mixture of shock and outrage at what they were witnessing. The young woman with her children approached closer and spoke directly to her own phone's camera, saying she was a witness to what was happening and that the black man had done absolutely nothing wrong or threatening. She described how she had arrived at the parking lot and seen the couple confronting the man aggressively, how they were blocking his path and how they had tried to prevent him from recording the interaction. Her narration was clear and factual, creating a real-time witness record that completely contradicted the version of events Robert was feeding to police. The older man also declared aloud that he was witnessing harassment and discriminatory behavior, and that he would stay on site until police arrived to give his own statement about what he had observed. Margaret tried to argue with the witnesses, insisting they didn't understand the full situation and were being manipulated, but her growing hysteria only made her seem increasingly less credible to anyone watching with rational eyes. 7 minutes later, 2 patrol cars entered the parking lot with flashing lights but no sirens, indicating the officers didn't consider this a high-priority emergency despite Robert's dramatic description in the call. 2 officers exited the vehicles, a Latino man of approximately 40 years old, named Officer Rodriguez, and a younger black woman named Officer Thompson, both wearing body cameras that began recording the moment they got out of their cars. Rodriguez immediately assessed the scene with experienced eyes, seeing a black man standing calmly beside his own car with visible shopping bags, an older white couple clearly agitated gesturing dramatically, and several witnesses with phones raised recording everything. The body language and positioning of everyone involved already told a story before any words were spoken, and Rodriguez exchanged a look with Thompson that suggested both already had a good idea of what was really happening here. DeAndre kept his hands visible and waited for the officers to approach, knowing from painful experience that sudden movements during police interactions could be misinterpreted with fatal consequences. Rodriguez approached first, asking calmly what was happening, and before DeAndre could respond, Margaret practically ran to the officer and began pouring out her distorted version of events. She said DeAndre had been lurking around the parking lot for a long period, that he had approached them threateningly, that when they politely asked what he was doing, he became hostile and aggressive. Robert joined his wife's narrative, adding that they were long-term residents of the neighborhood and knew all the people who belonged there, and that DeAndre was clearly someone who shouldn't be in that area. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, his face professional and neutral, but his eyes moved between the hysterical couple and DeAndre, who was standing calmly waiting his turn to speak. Thompson approached DeAndre separately and asked if he could explain his version of events, her voice deliberately calm and non-threatening, probably recognizing the tension in the situation and wanting to avoid any additional escalation. DeAndre took a deep breath and began explaining methodically, saying he had shopped at the supermarket, returned to his car, and was loading his bags when he was approached aggressively by the couple. DeAndre showed Thompson his phone with the recording still running, explaining he had captured much of the interaction on video, including the false accusations, the attempts to block his path, and the call to police based on fabricated lies. Thompson asked permission to view the video, and DeAndre navigated to the beginning of the recording, letting the officer watch several minutes of footage that clearly showed Margaret making her racist statements about him not belonging in the neighborhood and being the cause of rising crime. Thompson's expression remained professional, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she heard Margaret in the recording accusing DeAndre of threatening them when he simply asked to pass. The young woman with her children approached Rodriguez and offered her own testimony, saying she had everything recorded too and would be happy to provide her footage as evidence that the couple had been the aggressors from the start. The older man also offered to give a statement, emphasizing he had arrived in the middle of the confrontation, but had clearly seen DeAndre being prevented from leaving the location and being treated abusively without any justification. Rodriguez thanked the witnesses and asked for their contact information, his attitude professional, but the way he looked at Margaret and Robert made it clear their narrative was rapidly crumbling in the face of contradictory evidence and testimony. Thompson returned to where Rodriguez was talking with the couple, and the two officers briefly exchanged information in low voices, their expressions professional, but clearly aligned about what the evidence showed. Rodriguez then turned to Margaret and Robert and asked directly if they had any legal reason to prevent DeAndre from accessing his own vehicle in the public parking lot. Margaret immediately began talking about neighborhood safety and concerns about suspicious people, but Rodriguez politely interrupted her and repeated the question more specifically, asking if they had witnessed DeAndre committing any actual crime or had any concrete evidence of criminal activity beyond their suspicions based on appearance. Robert tried to argue that years of experience living in the neighborhood gave them the ability to recognize when something was wrong, but Thompson intervened, asking what specifically about DeAndre loading shopping bags from the supermarket to his own car seemed criminal or suspicious. The couple fell into uncomfortable silence, realizing that when forced to articulate their suspicions in concrete terms before police officers, they had absolutely nothing but racial prejudice to offer as justification. Rodriguez then informed the couple that based on video evidence from multiple sources and testimony from independent observers, it appeared they had made a false report to police and had engaged in harassment and possible unlawful detention by physically preventing DeAndre from leaving the parking lot. The words fell like bombs on Margaret and Robert's privilege bubble, who clearly had never considered their actions could have legal consequences for themselves. Margaret immediately became defensive, arguing they were victims being attacked for simply trying to keep their neighborhood safe, that they paid taxes and had rights too. Thompson responded calmly that yes, they had rights, but those rights didn't include the power to confront, harass, or detain other people based on nothing but their presence in a public space. Rodriguez added that making a false 911 call alleging threatening behavior when video evidence clearly showed the opposite was a crime that could result in charges, and that Margaret's explicit statement about people like DeAndre causing rising crime constituted clear evidence of discriminatory motivation. DeAndre remained calm throughout this entire exchange, but inside he felt a complex mixture of validation and sadness. Validation, because finally police officers were recognizing and confronting the racism he had experienced, but sadness because he knew this was only happening because there was irrefutable video evidence and witnesses willing to speak. How many other times had this happened to him or other black people without cameras present, without witnesses willing to intervene, resulting in nothing but unacknowledged trauma and ignored injustice? Thompson approached DeAndre again and asked if he would like to file a formal complaint against the couple for harassment and false reporting, explaining he had solid legal grounds to do so based on the collected evidence. DeAndre didn't hesitate in his response, saying yes, he definitely wanted to file a complaint because this type of behavior needed to have consequences, or it would continue happening to the next person Margaret and Robert decided didn't belong in their predominantly white neighborhood. You watching right now, have you gone through something similar where you were judged or confronted based purely on appearance? Type yes or no in the comments, because these experiences need to be shared and acknowledged. The conversation in the parking lot continued for another 20 minutes, while Rodriguez and Thompson collected formal statements from all parties involved and from witnesses. The young woman with her children provided contact information and emailed her recording to the police department right there from the parking lot, wanting to ensure the evidence was properly preserved. The older man gave a detailed statement about what he had observed, emphasizing that in his 72 years of life, he had seen this type of racial harassment many times and was fed up with staying silent while it continued happening. Other witnesses who had observed parts of the confrontation also approached to offer their testimonies, creating a chorus of voices that all told the same essential story of an innocent man being targeted by racial discrimination by a couple who thought they had the right to police who could or couldn't be in public spaces. Margaret began crying at some point during the process, apparently realizing the situation wasn't developing the way she had imagined when she called police. She tried to backtrack, saying she had misinterpreted the situation, that maybe she had overreacted, that she hadn't intended to do anything wrong. Robert tried a different approach, suggesting everyone was getting stressed over a simple misunderstanding, and it would be better if everyone just left and forgot the incident. Rodriguez made it very clear that's not how it worked, that when a formal complaint was filed and there was evidence of possible criminal behavior, the department was obligated to investigate fully. Thompson explained that the video showing Margaret explicitly saying DeAndre didn't belong in the neighborhood because it was a safe area, combined with her unfounded accusations and the attempt to prevent him from recording, created a very clear case of discriminatory conduct that couldn't simply be ignored as a misunderstanding. The couple was informed they would be summoned to appear before a judge and would face possible criminal and civil charges depending on how the prosecutor decided to proceed with the case. Words that transformed Margaret's tears from self-pity into something approaching true panic about the consequences of their actions. The officers finally allowed DeAndre to leave the parking lot after collecting all necessary information from him, and he drove home with his hands still trembling slightly on the steering wheel, the adrenaline from the confrontation finally draining from his system. When he arrived home, and his 6-year-old daughter ran to hug him with that bright smile that lit up any room, DeAndre felt a wave of emotion that almost made him break down, because all he wanted was to live in a world where she could grow up without having to experience the kind of gratuitous hatred he had faced that afternoon. His sister immediately noticed something was wrong from the expression on his face, and after his daughter went to play in another room, he told her everything that had happened, showing the video he had captured and explaining how a simple trip to the supermarket had transformed into a traumatic experience of blatant racism. She listened with a mixture of anger and tired familiarity, because she too had lived through similar moments throughout her life, moments where her mere existence in certain spaces was treated as inherently suspicious or threatening. DeAndre decided that night he wouldn't let this pass silently, that he would use every legal tool available to ensure Margaret and Robert faced real consequences for their actions. The officers finally allowed DeAndre to leave the parking lot after collecting all necessary information from him, and he drove home with his hands still trembling slightly on the steering wheel, the adrenaline from the confrontation finally draining from his system. When he arrived home and his 6-year-old daughter ran to hug him with that bright smile that lit up any room, DeAndre felt a wave of emotion that almost made him break down, because all he wanted was to live in a world where she could grow up without having to experience the kind of gratuitous hatred he had faced that afternoon. His sister immediately noticed something was wrong from the expression on his face, and after his daughter went to play in another room, he told her everything that had happened, showing the video he had captured and explaining how a simple trip to the supermarket had transformed into a traumatic experience of blatant racism. She listened with a mixture of anger and tired familiarity, because she too had lived through similar moments throughout her life, moments where her mere existence in certain spaces was treated as inherently suspicious or threatening. DeAndre decided that night he wouldn't let this pass silently, that he would use every legal tool available to ensure Margaret and Robert faced real consequences for their actions. The following Monday, DeAndre consulted with a lawyer specializing in civil rights and racial discrimination, a man named Marcus Chen, who had built a career defending victims of racial harassment and discriminatory behavior. Chen watched the complete video DeAndre had recorded, then reviewed the recordings from witnesses that had been shared with DeAndre through the police department, and his expression became increasingly serious as he absorbed the totality of the evidence. He explained to DeAndre that he had an extremely strong case not just for criminal charges the state was already pursuing, but also for a civil action for emotional distress, defamation through false allegations made to police, and violation of his civil rights under various state and federal laws. Chen outlined that cases like this usually ended in settlements because defendants realized they had no defense when confronted with such clear video evidence and testimony from multiple independent witnesses. DeAndre authorized Chen to proceed with a comprehensive civil lawsuit, making clear his primary goal wasn't necessarily obtaining a large sum of money, but rather sending a message that this type of racist behavior had real and tangible costs. The civil lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later, citing Margaret and Robert Henderson for multiple violations, including unlawful detention, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and civil rights violations. The amount of damages requested was significant, including compensatory damages for the trauma and humiliation experienced by DeAndre, punitive damages intended to punish the defendants particularly, egregious behavior and discourage others from similar conduct, and attorney fees that would accumulate the longer the case took. When Margaret and Robert received notice of the lawsuit, they immediately rushed to hire their own attorney, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had a reputation for defending clients in difficult cases, but who appeared visibly uncomfortable when he reviewed the evidence against his new clients. Whitmore explained frankly to Margaret and Robert that they had made several critical mistakes, first by confronting DeAndre without any legal justification, second, by physically blocking his path constituting unlawful detention, third, by making explicitly racist statements that were captured on video, and fourth, by calling police with false allegations that were immediately contradicted by evidence and witnesses. Each of these mistakes individually was problematic, but combined they created a case that would be nearly impossible to defend successfully in court. The criminal charges were also advancing in parallel to the civil lawsuit, with the district attorney deciding to proceed with charges of making a false report to police, a misdemeanor that could result in up to 1 year in jail and substantial fines. Margaret and Robert were formally charged and had to appear in court for a preliminary hearing where the judge reviewed the basic evidence and determined there was sufficient probable cause for the cases to proceed. Their criminal attorney, a different man specialized in criminal defense named Robert Hayes, tried to argue his clients had simply made an honest error in judgment and had no malicious intent, but the prosecutor presented clips from the video showing Margaret's explicit statements about DeAndre not belonging in the neighborhood and causing rising crime. The judge watched the clips with an increasingly disapproving expression, and when Hayes tried to argue these were just protected expressions of safety concerns, the judge interrupted, asking specifically what characteristic of DeAndre carrying shopping bags to his car justified these safety concerns. Hayes had no adequate answer because there was no adequate answer beyond admitting the obvious racial profiling that motivated the entire interaction. The story quickly gained local media attention after civil rights activists publicized the case as an example of casual racism having real consequences, and the parking lot video went viral on social media with millions of views and comments. People across the country watched Margaret saying DeAndre didn't belong in the safe neighborhood and were outraged, sharing their own stories of being racially profiled or confronted for simply existing in public spaces. Local news reports interviewed DeAndre, who spoke eloquently about how the experience had affected him and about the importance of holding people accountable for discriminatory behavior. He emphasized he wasn't seeking revenge but rather justice, and that he hoped his case could encourage others who experienced similar situations to not stay silent, but instead use the legal system to defend their rights. Margaret and Robert tried to avoid media attention, but reporters showed up at their house, neighbors began avoiding them on the streets, and some of their friends and acquaintances distanced themselves after seeing the video and realizing they could no longer pretend ignorance about the couple's racial prejudices that had probably always existed, but were now exposed in high definition for the whole world to see and judge. The following months were a growing nightmare for Margaret and Robert, as both cases, criminal and civil, advanced through the legal system with relentless inevitability. Their attorney in the civil case, Gerald Whitmore, tried to negotiate a settlement several times, but DeAndre and his attorney, Marcus Chen, rejected the initial offers as insultingly low and not reflecting the severity of what had happened. Margaret and Robert were discovering their actions in that parking lot were costing much more than they had imagined, not just in terms of attorney fees that had already exceeded $50,000 between the two cases, but also in terms of their reputation in the community and their personal relationships that were disintegrating under the weight of public exposure. The Neighborhood Homeowners Association held a special meeting where several residents expressed discomfort with Margaret and Robert's behavior, with some suggesting perhaps the couple should consider moving if they couldn't accept the growing diversity of the area. The irony was not lost on anyone that Margaret and Robert, who had tried to drive DeAndre away for not belonging there, were now themselves being subtly invited to leave for having embarrassed the entire neighborhood with their video-captured racism. The criminal case went to trial first, and the prosecutor presented a devastatingly simple case based almost entirely on video evidence that spoke for itself. The jury watched DeAndre's recording showing Margaret making her discriminatory statements, watched Robert blocking DeAndre's path and demanding he leave, watched the 911 call where Robert fabricated allegations of threatening behavior that clearly didn't exist. The witnesses who had been present in the parking lot testified, including the young mother and the older man, both describing how they had seen DeAndre being harassed without provocation and how the couple had tried to prevent him from documenting the incident. Officer Rodriguez himself testified about how he arrived at the scene and immediately realized through multiple cameras and testimonies that Robert's story didn't match the reality of the situation. The defense tried to argue Margaret and Robert were genuinely concerned about safety and had acted in good faith, but when the prosecutor played again the part of the video where Margaret explicitly says people like DeAndre were why crime was going up, it became clear to everyone in the courtroom this wasn't about safety, but rather about pure and simple racial prejudice. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts for both Margaret and Robert Henderson on charges of making a false report to police. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later and made clear during preliminary comments that he considered the defendants' actions particularly disturbing because they involved not just lying to police, but doing so in a manner that could have placed DeAndre in real danger if the responding officers had been less professional or more prone to automatically believing the word of white citizens against a black man. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor argued for jail time because the defendant's behavior wasn't a momentary mistake, but rather a series of deliberate choices to harass, defame, and potentially criminalize an innocent man based solely on his race. DeAndre gave a victim impact statement that was emotionally powerful, describing how the experience had made him question whether he and his daughter were truly safe in their new neighborhood, how he now felt anxious every time he went shopping or drove through certain areas, how he had to have painful conversations with his 6-year-old daughter about why some people might treat her unfairly because of the color of her skin. His words clearly impacted the judge, whose expression became increasingly serious as DeAndre spoke about the lasting trauma caused by that afternoon in the parking lot. The judge sentenced Margaret Henderson to 6 months in county jail, 3 years probation after release, 200 hours of community service specifically working with civil rights organizations, and mandatory classes on racial sensitivity and implicit bias. Robert Henderson received a slightly more severe sentence of 9 months in jail because the judge determined his physical blocking of DeAndre's path and his aggressive posture during the confrontation constituted an element of physical intimidation that made his actions even more serious, along with identical probation and community service requirements. The judge stated during sentencing that he hoped the time in jail would give both defendants opportunity to reflect on how their prejudice and sense of entitlement had led them to violate an innocent man's rights, and that the racial sensitivity classes weren't punishment, but rather an educational opportunity they clearly desperately needed. Margaret began crying when the jail sentence was pronounced, apparently shocked she would actually have to serve time behind bars for actions she probably thought would never have serious consequences. Robert went pale and silent, the weight of reality finally penetrating through his arrogance that white privilege wasn't absolute protection against consequences when you broke the law in such flagrant and documented ways. The civil case was scheduled to go to trial 2 months after the criminal case concluded, but the criminal conviction dramatically changed the risk calculation for Margaret and Robert and their attorney. Whitmore strongly advised his clients to negotiate a settlement because they would now be convicted defendants in a criminal case when the civil jury heard about their actions, making it nearly impossible to argue they were victims of a misunderstanding or had acted in good faith. Marcus Chen, DeAndre's attorney, leveraged this weakened position and presented a settlement demand that was substantially higher than previous offers, arguing the criminal conviction proved beyond any doubt that Margaret and Robert had acted maliciously and illegally. After several rounds of tense negotiations, a settlement was finally reached, where Margaret and Robert agreed to pay DeAndre $375,000 in combined damages, an amount that represented almost all the couple's liquid assets and would force them to sell their house and move to something much more modest. The settlement also included a formal written admission that their actions had been motivated by racial prejudice and a public apology that would be published in local newspapers, requirements Chen insisted on because he wanted public acknowledgement of the discriminatory nature of what had happened, not just a silent money transfer that allowed defendants to avoid full accountability. Margaret and Robert's public apology appeared in local newspapers 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, and it was a statement carefully crafted by lawyers, but still unequivocally admitted they had confronted DeAndre Patterson based on racial prejudice and that their actions had been wrong both legally and morally. The statement acknowledged DeAndre had done nothing suspicious or illegal, that their accusations against him were unfounded and motivated by bias, and that they deeply regretted the pain and trauma they had caused him and his family. For many people in the community, this public admission was significant, because rarely are defendants in racial discrimination cases forced to openly acknowledge their prejudices instead of simply paying money quietly and moving on. Civil rights activists praised the settlement as establishing an important precedent that casual racism would have serious financial consequences, and hoped future cases could point to this one as an example that racial harassment would not be tolerated or treated as a minor offense. Margaret and Robert began serving their jail sentences the same week, processed into different county jail facilities where they would face the reality that actions have consequences regardless of privilege or prior economic status. The experience would be profoundly humiliating for both, especially because other inmates quickly discovered why they were there since the case had been widely reported in local news. Margaret found the jail environment especially difficult, having lived a life of relative comfort and privilege where she had never faced real consequences for her behavior or attitudes. Robert struggled with the loss of autonomy and control, discovering that in jail he had no power to intimidate or control others the way he had tried to do with DeAndre in that parking lot. Both would have plenty of time during their sentences to reflect on how a few minutes of publicly expressed racial hatred had completely destroyed their finances, reputation, and sense of security in the world, a reversal of circumstances that ironically mirrored what they had tried to do to DeAndre. Margaret and Robert's house was put up for sale out of financial necessity, since they needed to raise funds to pay the settlement to DeAndre and cover the massive legal costs they had accumulated. The property sold quickly, but for less than they hoped, partly because potential buyers had heard about the case, and some were uncomfortable buying the house known as the home of the racist parking lot couple. The money from the sale, after paying all legal obligations, left Margaret and Robert with very limited resources to start over when they eventually got out of jail. Friends who had been close for years permanently distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with people whose racism had been so publicly exposed and condemned. Family members expressed shame and disappointment, with some cutting contact completely, because they couldn't reconcile the people they thought they knew with the actions captured in that viral video. Margaret and Robert were experiencing something that rarely happens to people of their privilege level: the total disintegration of their social and financial lives as a direct consequence of discriminatory behavior, a kind of justice many victims of racism rarely see realized so completely. DeAndre used a substantial portion of the settlement money to establish an educational fund for his daughter, ensuring she would have resources to attend any college she chose when the time came. He also donated a significant amount to civil rights organizations working to combat housing discrimination and racial profiling, feeling it was important to use something good coming from such a negative experience. The rest of the money went toward establishing his family financially in ways that would reduce future stress and anxiety, allowing him to focus on raising his daughter without the constant financial pressures many working-class families face. But DeAndre was clear in interviews that the money wasn't the most important aspect of the outcome. What really mattered was the validation that what he experienced was wrong, that he wasn't overreacting or being too sensitive, and that the legal system had recognized and punished the injustice he suffered. For many victims of racism, this validation is something they never receive. So the fact that DeAndre obtained not just acknowledgement, but also real consequences for his aggressors was significant beyond just the financial settlement. The story of DeAndre's case spread far beyond the local community, being featured on national news programs and discussed widely on social media as an example of how documenting racist interactions can lead to real justice. The parking lot video was used in training programs for police officers on how to recognize and properly respond to calls that may be motivated by racial profiling. Law schools incorporated the case into curricula discussing civil rights and legal remedies for discrimination. Civil rights organizations pointed to it as demonstration that while systemic racism was still a massive problem, individual cases of blatant racism could be successfully fought when there was solid evidence and victims willing to pursue justice despite the personal and emotional costs involved. The case became a kind of case study on what can happen when casual racists encounter real consequences, serving as warning to others who might consider harassing or confronting people based on race that their actions could cost much more than they imagined if caught on video and taken seriously by the legal system. 6 months after the original parking lot incident, DeAndre was invited to speak on a panel about racial discrimination and justice at a local university, where he shared his experience with a room full of students, professors, and community members. He described not just the events of that day, but also the lasting emotional impact the confrontation had on him and his family, how he now carried his phone always ready to record because he never knew when he might need to document another similar situation. DeAndre spoke about the anxiety he developed doing simple everyday tasks like going to the supermarket or driving through his neighborhood, always hyper-aware of how he was perceived and whether someone might question his right to be there. He explained that even with the successful legal outcome, the trauma of racism didn't simply disappear because there was justice, that there were still nights where he replayed the confrontation in his mind, thinking about all the ways it could have gone wrong if the responding officers hadn't been professional, or if he had reacted with anger instead of maintaining calm. The vulnerability and honesty with which DeAndre shared his story profoundly impacted the audience, with several people approaching afterward to share their own experiences of racism and thank him for having the courage to fight for justice publicly. During the question and answer session after his presentation, a white student asked what white people should do when witnessing racism happening, like that young mother and older man had done in the parking lot. DeAndre responded that the most important thing was not to stay silent, that witnesses who are willing to intervene verbally and record evidence make a huge difference in cases like his. He emphasized that if those witnesses hadn't spoken up and provided their own recordings and testimonies, the case would have been much more difficult to prove because it would become essentially his word against Margaret and Robert's, and the legal system unfortunately still tends to favor white people in he said, she said situations. DeAndre also addressed the importance of understanding that racism isn't always burning crosses and obvious violence, that it frequently manifests exactly as it happened to him, in assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces, in decisions about who looks suspicious or threatening based purely on racial characteristics. He encouraged the audience to examine their own implicit biases and challenge racist assumptions when they saw them in their families, workplaces, and communities, because real change requires not just punishing obvious racism, but also confronting the more subtle prejudices that sustain it. Margaret and Robert completed their jail sentences and were released to probation, merging into a world very different from the one they had left months before. They no longer had their own home, living in a small rented apartment in a neighborhood much less affluent than they were accustomed to. Their retirement savings were devastated by legal obligations in the settlement, forcing both to seek part-time work to supplement their limited income, a particular humiliation for people who had taken pride in their comfortable retirement. Probation requirements meant they had to attend regular counseling sessions and complete their community service hours working with organizations, fighting against the exact type of discrimination they had perpetrated. Margaret spent her hours at a community center serving predominantly Black and Latino families, where she initially maintained emotional distance, but gradually, through repeated forced interactions with people she had previously considered inferior or threatening, began confronting some of her deepest prejudices. Robert worked at a legal access program helping low-income people navigate legal issues, an experience that exposed him to realities of how the legal system fails disproportionately with minority communities and people without resources. The mandatory racial sensitivity classes both attended were conducted by a psychologist specializing in implicit bias and racial reconciliation, a Black woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, who had no patience for excuses but was genuinely committed to helping people understand and deconstruct their prejudices if they were willing to do the difficult work. Initially, Margaret and Robert approached the classes with resistance and resentment, seeing them as unfair punishment rather than growth opportunity. But Dr. Williams had a way of challenging their victimization narratives that eventually penetrated their defenses. She had them watch videos of their own actions in the parking lot repeatedly, forcing them to objectively confront their behavior instead of hiding behind rationalizations. She had them read testimonies from countless people who had experienced similar racial discrimination and consider the cumulative impact of thousands of small humiliations and confrontations over a lifetime. She challenged them to specifically articulate what about DeAndre carrying shopping bags justified their response, leading them through a Socratic process that forced them to admit there was nothing but their own racist presumption that a Black man in their neighborhood must be doing something wrong. Interestingly, the impact of the classes and community service seemed different for each of them. Margaret, after months of forced exposure to people and perspectives she previously avoided, began showing signs of genuine remorse and perspective change, crying during a group session when she finally understood emotionally, not just intellectually, the harm she had caused DeAndre and what her attitude represented for a larger system of oppression. Robert remained more resistant, fulfilling requirements because he had to, but never fully embracing the possibility that his fundamental worldviews were wrong, a difference that would eventually contribute to the dissolution of their marriage when Margaret decided she could no longer remain married to someone whose inability to recognize and change his racism constantly reminded her of the worst moment of her life. The couple who had united in racial hatred against DeAndre ended up separating because one was able to begin the difficult work of personal change, while the other remained trapped in the same attitudes that had destroyed them financially and socially, a final irony in a story full of them. 1 year after the original incident, DeAndre received an unexpected email from Margaret Henderson asking if he would be willing to meet with her in person for a conversation. The email was carefully written, making no excuses, but expressing that she had gone through significant changes during the past year and wanted the opportunity to speak with him directly, not to ask for forgiveness or absolution, but simply to acknowledge what she had done in a more personal way than the legally required public apology allowed. DeAndre was initially hesitant, consulting his therapist and his sister about whether it was a good idea to expose himself again to someone who had caused him so much trauma, but eventually decided to accept the meeting with the condition it happen in a public space with his sister present as support. They met at a quiet cafe on a weekday, and the Margaret who appeared was visibly different from the furious woman in the parking lot video. She looked older, more tired, but also somehow more human in her obvious vulnerability. She thanked DeAndre for being willing to meet with her, and then, with trembling voice, began talking about the past year and what she had learned about herself through the painful process of consequences and forced reflection. Margaret described how jail had been terrifying and humiliating, how she initially saw herself as victim of a cancel culture that had destroyed her life for a single mistake, but how over months in counseling sessions and community service, she gradually began understanding it hadn't been a single mistake, but rather the result of decades of unexamined prejudices and privilege that made her believe she had the right to question and control the movements of people she considered not belonging. She spoke about meeting people at the community center where she worked, hearing their stories of being followed in stores, stopped by police for no reason, questioned in their own neighborhoods, and finally beginning to connect these patterns with what she had done to DeAndre. She admitted she was still working through her prejudices, that she recognized she couldn't simply unlearn decades of racist socialization in a few months, but that for the first time in her life, she was truly trying to see and understand the world from the perspective of people who didn't look like her. Margaret made clear she wasn't asking for DeAndre's forgiveness, that she understood he owed her nothing, and that the harm she caused couldn't be undone by remorse or personal change. But she wanted him to know her actions that day had been the catalyst for her finally confronting truths about herself she had avoided her entire life. DeAndre listened without interrupting, processing the apparent sincerity in Margaret's words, but also maintaining healthy skepticism born of knowing racists frequently learn to perform remorse when it serves their interests. When she finished speaking, he took a deep breath and shared his own perspective, describing how that day in the parking lot had robbed him and his daughter of a sense of safety in their own neighborhood, how he now carried anxiety doing the simplest tasks, how he had to explain to a 6-year-old child concepts of racial hatred no child should have to understand so early. DeAndre told Margaret he appreciated she was doing personal work to change, but that one person doing internal work didn't solve the systemic problem of how many other Margarets and Roberts existed in the world who would never be caught on video, never face consequences, and would continue causing harm to black and brown people every day. He explained his case had become public and successful due to a combination of having recorded evidence, brave witnesses, professional police officers, resources to hire a good lawyer, and willingness to go through a long and emotionally exhausting legal process, but that the vast majority of people experiencing daily racism didn't have access to these resources or simply didn't have the energy to fight because they were busy trying to survive and care for their families. Margaret listened to DeAndre's words with tears streaming down her face, nodding in acknowledgement as he spoke about how his individual case being resolved didn't change the larger systems of racial oppression that existed in housing, education, employment, and law enforcement. DeAndre finished by saying that if Margaret truly wanted to do something meaningful with the second chance she was getting, she needed to go beyond personal work and actively work to dismantle the systems and structures that allowed racism like hers to thrive. That meant using her privilege as a white woman to speak up when she saw other white people behaving in discriminatory ways, supporting policies and candidates fighting for racial justice, and understanding that anti-racism wasn't a destination you reached, but an ongoing process of unlearning and relearning that lasted a lifetime. Margaret promised she would do that work, and while DeAndre wasn't certain he completely believed her, he acknowledged he was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, because genuine transformation, when it happened, should be recognized even if it didn't eliminate past harm. They parted not as friends, but as two people who had shared a terrible experience and were trying, each in their own way, to make sense of it and use it to create some kind of positive change in the world. In the following months, Margaret unexpectedly became a voice in her predominantly white community speaking about racism and privilege, using her own story as example of how well-meaning white people could still carry and act on deeply ingrained prejudices. She wrote an article for the local newspaper about her experience, not painting herself as redeemed or heroic, but honestly describing her journey from denial to remorse to tentative commitment to change. Some in the community praised her for her courage in speaking out, while others criticized her either for attention-seeking or for not going far enough in her critique of systemic racism. Margaret accepted both types of feedback, acknowledging she had forfeited the right to expect people to treat her gently after what she had done, and that becoming a controversial public figure was a small price to pay if it meant even one person might be led to examine their own prejudices before acting on them. She began volunteering with racial justice organizations, not in leadership positions, but doing basic support work, Recognizing her role wasn't to lead, but rather to use her resources and access to amplify the voices of people of color who had been doing this work for decades without adequate recognition or resources. 2 years after that fateful day in the parking lot, DeAndre was living a life that had stabilized into a new normal, still carrying the emotional scars from the experience, but also having found purpose in transforming his trauma into advocacy for others facing similar discrimination. He had become a regular speaker at community events and conferences about racial justice, sharing his story not to victimize himself, but to illuminate how casual racism operated and how people could use legal tools to defend themselves when facing discrimination. His daughter, now 8 years old, was growing up with an awareness of social justice that was both inspiring and a painful reminder that she would have to navigate a world that would still judge her by the color of her skin before knowing her character. DeAndre had used part of the settlement money to establish a small nonprofit organization that provided legal resources and support for victims of racial discrimination who lacked means to fight for justice, essentially creating a support system he wished had been available before his own traumatic experience. The organization had already helped dozens of people document incidents, connect with lawyers, and navigate the often intimidating process of seeking accountability through the legal system. The broader impact of DeAndre's case continued to ripple through various institutions and communities long after the original events. The city where the incident occurred had implemented new training for police officers on how to respond to calls that might be motivated by racial profiling, using the parking lot video as a central example of how to recognize and properly handle situations where callers are making unfounded allegations based on prejudice. Several businesses and organizations in the area had revised their policies on discrimination and implemented more robust training programs for employees, recognizing the case had exposed the extent to which casual racism still permeated their communities. Local schools incorporated discussions about the incident into their civics classes, using it as a starting point for difficult but necessary conversations about race, privilege, and justice. The case had become a kind of dividing line in the community, separating those who saw it as a necessary example of consequences for racist behavior from those who thought Margaret and Robert had been treated too harshly, a division that reflected deeper cleavages about how people understood and responded to issues of racial injustice. Think about this for a moment. How many times have you witnessed something similar and done nothing? Drop your answer in the comments because these conversations matter. Margaret continued her work with racial justice organizations, becoming particularly focused on educating other white people about how to recognize and interrupt racism in their own communities. She had divorced Robert, who remained largely unchanged by the entire experience, and continued blaming others for his circumstances instead of accepting responsibility for his own actions. Margaret's transformation wasn't perfect or complete. She still made mistakes and sometimes said things that revealed lingering prejudices, but the difference was she was now willing to be corrected and learn instead of defending her positions with arrogance. Some people in the racial justice community remained skeptical about her motivation, questioning whether her activism was genuine or simply a form of image rehabilitation, but others recognized genuine transformation would always be imperfect, and that white people doing real work to confront racism in their own communities, even imperfectly, was valuable simply because so few were willing to do that work. DeAndre and Margaret maintained occasional contact, meeting perhaps once every few months to talk about the work each was doing and about the complicated ways their lives had become intertwined through that shared traumatic experience. It never became friendship exactly. There was too much harm and too much power imbalance in their shared history for true friendship to be possible. But there was a kind of mutual understanding that came from both having been irrevocably changed by those minutes in the parking lot. Margaret often asked DeAndre about his work with discrimination victims, listening to stories that helped her understand her case wasn't an aberration, but part of a much larger pattern of everyday racism Black people navigated constantly. DeAndre sometimes shared insights about how white communities could do better work confronting racism internally, recognizing that while systemic change was necessary, changes in individual attitudes and behaviors also mattered because racism was perpetrated by individuals making choices about how to treat other human beings. Their story was eventually featured in a documentary about racial justice and accountability, showing not just the original incident, but also the aftermath and the different journeys DeAndre and Margaret had traveled in the years since. The documentary didn't try to present a clean narrative of redemption or reconciliation, but instead honestly explored the complexities of how trauma, justice, remorse, and change worked in real cases where people had to continue living with the consequences of actions and experiences long after the initial events. Audiences responded to the documentary with mixed reactions, some feeling it gave too much screen time to Margaret and potentially humanized her in ways victims of racism rarely receive. Others, appreciating it, showed genuine transformation was possible even for people who had caused real harm through their racism. DeAndre hoped the documentary could inspire other victims of discrimination to know justice was possible and encourage witnesses to intervene when they saw racism happening, while also perhaps, just perhaps, making some people who carried prejudices similar to Margaret and Roberts think twice before acting on them. If it saved even one person from experiencing the trauma he had experienced, then the entire difficult process of making his story public would have been worth it. Because in the end, it wasn't really about him or about Margaret and Robert, but about creating a world where his daughter and all children like her could live without fear of being questioned, harassed, or considered threatening simply for existing in public spaces.